Thanks, Justin. It's good to see everyone. Front row, you're within spitting range tonight. Of course, I said that to somebody, and they said, yeah, but I'll spit back, so we'll see. Let's begin part 2 of our study. There are 14 lessons to our study called Sacred Moments. So after tonight, we'll be halfway through. For those of you that maybe have just joined us, we had the first Wednesday night talking about the offerings and the feast days in general. And then for the next 5 Wednesday nights, we talked about the 5 offerings and what they symbolized, what they meant. Now, we're going to move to part 2, where we talk about the feast days, like the Day of Atonement, Feast of Pentecost. You know the names, you know the terms. I want to begin by talking about the Sabbath, because the Sabbath isn't an annual feast. It's a weekly, and then and every 7 years, and then at the end of 7-year periods, the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. But I think the Sabbath helps us. I think it needs to be considered with this group because the Lord put it together, even though it's a little different than the others. So, Father, help us tonight as we begin to talk about these festivals and special days. Give us your help and grace in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, your outline tonight has 2 parts to it. The first is the notes for tonight, and then you've got a second page called The Sabbath and the Lord's Day. It's from the book I wrote called The Essentials. I forget which lesson it is, but back in the part where we talk about how we worship and why we worship, we talked about the Sabbath and the Lord's Day and things like why we worship on Sunday and not the Sabbath day as Christians. And we'll cover most of that tonight, but I wanted you to have just this little lesson that we had on the Sabbath day. It'll probably enable you to go into more detail than I'll have time to do tonight. Now, let's talk about some thoughts concerning the holy days as we begin our study. Number one, we want to understand that these observances were given by divine revelation, and we introduce a word that we don't hear a lot today. It's the word type. And a type is an Old Testament term that speaks of foreshadowings of the day of grace in which we live. Now, you say, well, so if the Old Testament represents something, that's a type. No, a type is more specific than that. You can learn a lesson from an event in the Old Testament, but that's not a type. You can make a comparison or a moral lesson or an object lesson out of something in the Old Testament, but that doesn't make it a type. A type is a very narrow definition, and what it means is that God gave something or someone as a foreshadowing. In other words, if you want to understand what's coming, look at what God is doing here, and that will describe what's coming. It's not just some similarities. I can say that when we study the life of Isaac, I can say that Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, who went to get a bride for the son, that's like the work of the Holy Spirit, but that's not a type, in my opinion. That wasn't a type of the Holy Spirit. There was just some symbolic likenesses and some commonalities, but it wasn't a type. A type is, this is what the Old Testament had, and as you study the type, it explains what's coming. It's sort of like a parable that's used in the New Testament, and I know we've talked about this, but as the church grows, we have new people, so forgive me for repeating. The word parable comes from a Greek word parabole, which means literally that which is cast alongside. So a parable was a story cast alongside a teaching to illustrate the teaching. A parable, not every point has a point. You know, when you study parables, you don't have, 15 designations of this means this means this, this means this, this means this. A parable basically says there's a lesson to learn here. Not 12 lessons, but there's a lesson to learn, okay? But types are more specific. There are several applications and there are several comparisons that we look at. So a type is in the same family as a parable, but it's much more specific. Number 3, the first study of the offerings explained the way to God and how to live in continued fellowship. And I think those were types, by the way. They were types of the victorious Christian life. The second part that we're beginning tonight illustrates our separation from the worldly system as we celebrate the life and means of grace through the holy feast days. The holy days, the festivals, showed Israel's separation. God said, you're not like the people around you. This is how you're different. And whenever you have these festivals, this shows and reminds you of how different you are, okay? It was a celebration of their faith. Now we're going to begin by studying the Sabbath, as I said, then go to the feasts of Jehovah. Let's talk about our general approach for just a second. The feasts were observed in April through October, according to our calendar. Now, there's a little bit of confusion because the Jewish New Year is in the fall, but when we study Passover next week, we'll discover that even though it's in the spring, God says this is the first month. And that's confusing because 7 months earlier, he said this is the first month. And, unless you have months of like 48 days, that math doesn't work. But what you find out is that there was a civil calendar and there was a religious calendar. And God, when he called the Passover occurring in the first month, he meant the first month of the festivals. It was the first month, not of the year, but it was the month where the festivals began. And that's why it might be a little bit confusing. But it happened between April and October on our calendar. Sometimes it might begin as early as the end of March, and sometimes it might go into October. But into October. Sometimes it would stop at September. But the reason that these months were chosen, it was the time when travel was easiest for the people of God. It was the time for them. It wasn't the rainy season. It wasn't the winter season. It was a time when travel was easiest, and it took into consideration the demands on the time available to farmers. Farmers did not, it was not good for them to travel during planting and harvesting. And God put these holy days strategically. Now, some of them are near harvest, and some of them are near planting, but he designed it so that it was not a burden for the farmers of Israel to make that trip because they were required to go to Jerusalem. The Lord has no desire to make our spiritual journey a burden to us. I knew Christians growing up that I honored them and I respected them, and only as I got older did I understand them. They gave the impression that if anything was pleasurable, it wasn't of the Lord. They gave the impression that if you enjoyed something, there was probably something evil about it. And one of the happiest events in my life, it wasn't in a day, but was the period of time where I began to understand that the Lord takes no delight in making us miserable. Now, he expects sacrifice. He expects integrity of worship. But I want to tell you that I cannot overemphasize the liberty that came to me when I realized, as I say often, there's nothing I can do to make him love me more. And there's nothing I will do that will make him love me less. And that wasn't a liberty that said, hey, I can live any way I want to. It was a liberty where I realized I have a God who loves me and his system works. Well, the 7 feasts were observed by all males of Israel. In some scriptural passages, the 7 feasts are referred to as 3 feasts. That's another point of confusion. You know, the year begins in October, the first month is in the spring, okay? Another point of confusion is that in some Bible passages, we're looking at 7 festivals. In others, we're looking at 3. But the reason that we have this thing of 7 and 3 is because the time between the feasts was spaced so that only 3 trips to Jerusalem were necessary. In other words, 3 trips to Jerusalem encompassed 7 festivals. For instance, the first festival, Passover, what we'll be talking about next week, it involved Passover on the evening of the 14th day. This is number 7 on your notes. I think you got this, don't you? Okay. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, beginning the next day on the 15th day and lasting for a week. And then the Feast of First Fruits was on the 16th day. So you've got Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Feast of First Fruits all right there together. And sometimes it was referred to, these 3 feasts were referred to as Passover, because you came to Jerusalem for all 3 feasts. And then 7 weeks later, number 8 on your outline, a second journey was required for the observance of the Feast of Pentecost. Now, the Feast of Pentecost is special because we know what happened on the day of Pentecost. It was a festival that stood alone and was celebrated on the 16th day of the 3rd month, okay? The third festival, plural, was in the 7th month and was for the remaining 3 feasts, which are collectively referred to as tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles. It was the Feast of Trumpets on the 1st day of that month, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the month, and the Feast of Tabernacles was a week-long event, 15 through 22. So that's why sometimes it says 7, sometimes it says 3. It was 3 trips to celebrate 7 festivals. In addition to the 7 feasts of Jehovah, there were Sabbath celebrations. The weekly Sabbath is the one we're most familiar with, as well as some other Sabbath designations. These feasts were not in relation to food. In fact, one of them was a fast, but they were festive occasions. To understand the Sabbath, there are 2 words we need to remember, and this is where we begin to kind of get into the lesson tonight. The first word is the word cessation. Sabbath was about cessation. You cease from something. There was to be a stopping of daily work for the most part in order to rest. And when I say for the most part, if your ox was in the ditch on the Sabbath, you were allowed to get the ox out of the ditch. You were allowed to do good on the Sabbath, even if it required effort. The Pharisees had put such restrictions around the Sabbath that, we laugh about, and we've talked about it. If a flea was on you, you couldn't scratch because that was hunting. Couldn't eat an egg late on the Sabbath. You know, those kind of silly things. And forgive me for saying stuff we've already said, but I want to be sure everyone understands. The Old Testament, depending on how you count, has either 612 or 614 commandments. The laws of the rabbis increased that number from 612 or 614 to over 6,000 laws. They were called fence laws. And the reason they were called fence laws is they wanted to be so sure they didn't break the law, but it was for the wrong motive, and it was handled the wrong way. They said, we not only, like if the camera there is the sin, and we don't want to get close to that, they would put, on average, they would put 10 fences between me and the camera so that I couldn't even get close to the camera. But what that did, I didn't touch the camera, but what it did is it created such a burden that later it would be said, neither you nor your fathers were able to bear these burdens. You were not able to do it. And Jesus would say of those fence laws, not of the Old Testament, but of the fence laws, he would say, you have made the commandments of men more important than the commandments of God. And always remember, loved ones, Jesus was never down on the law. Jesus never wrote off the law. Jesus never discounted the Ten Commandments, like some people, even in Christianity, try to do today, or the Old Testament commands. He never had an issue with that. He said, I've come to fulfill the law, but it was these fence laws that infuriated the Lord, you know. And we have a tendency to just look at something and take the surface. You know, I've had people leave probably every church I've pastored whenever we would allow the missionettes to have a bake sale or an evangelist to sell. Boy, I started to date myself. I started to say his records. Okay, let me get a little more modern. Sell his 8-tracks, you know, or whatever. Because they said Jesus turned over the table because people were selling. No, when you look at what Jesus did, Jesus was not upset because an exchange of money was taking place. Jesus was upset because Jesus always got upset when somebody did anything to make it hard for people to get to Father. And he turned over the table of the money changers because people would come to pay the temple tax or the offering that enabled them to worship. But when they came from other lands or from other provinces, those men who were manning the table said, I'm sorry, this coin from this province is not acceptable. You'll have to buy an acceptable coin. And they would charge outrageous fees. It's like some of our businesses, even in Colombia, where they'll say, oh, you know, you can get a loan, payday loan, but we're going to charge you 400% interest. You see, that was the kind of business that was going on at the table. They would bring their lamb, their sacrifice, all the way from home. And it might have been verified by a rabbi there in town, but in the temple, there was something wrong found with it. But don't worry. We know that you walked 8 days to get here, and this is the only lamb you've got. But you can buy another one over here. Probably on average 12 to 15 times the price. And that's what Jesus was upset about. Jesus does not get upset because missionettes are selling baked goods to go, you know, on a mission trip. Jesus gets upset when anybody makes it hard for someone to get to Father. So that's just, I don't know how you got off on this. Let's just, it's the idea of cessation, okay? There's a stopping of daily work for the most part in order to rest. And the second word is celebration. There was to be a joining of God's people together for a time in His Word and fellowship together. Now, the Sabbath in the Old Testament was not a church gathering like we know. There were times that happened, and that was not uncommon. The Jews gathered more than you might think they gathered, but it was not like a get dressed and go to church day. It might be a celebration with the family. It might be a celebration in the community, but it was a day when you stopped your work and you celebrated God. Now, this is what Leviticus 23, 2-3 says. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts. 6 days, and before he starts giving all of these other days, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. Now, we're going to find out later that the Sabbath was a matter of the heart. We know that one man died because he gathered sticks on the Sabbath day. But it was not God saying you can't pick up a stick on the Sabbath day. It was a man doing work that could have been done on any of the other 6 days, and it reflected an attitude of his heart. We'll talk about that attitude in just a minute. So with that in mind, let's look at the principle of the Sabbath. There are 6 things we need to understand about the Sabbath, and then we're going to tie it together with Christian life lessons. The first principle of the Sabbath is the principle of trust. The Sabbath was a day of rest, and when you observed the Sabbath, this is what you did. You exercised the surrender of profit. In other words, it wasn't God just saying you can't work. It was a primal law of Israel. He said, I want you to understand that to serve me, you have to trust me. And you have to understand that by putting me first, I can take care of you in 6 days of work when you think you need to work every day. It was for our benefit. It was about trusting the Lord. Chick-fil-A, they've tapped into a principle that few businesses understand. And that is, we believe it's important for every family, and no offense to somebody that works somewhere else, I'm just using them as an example. They said, we believe that it is important for families to be able to have a day together. So even though we are losing, in theory, a truckload of money, we think the seventh day rest principle is important enough to follow. Now, the executive leadership of Chick-fil-A, and I've listened to them. I've been in meetings with them. They say that they make more in 6 days than most of their competitors make in 7. And they believe it's the blessing of God. I listened. I can't think of his name. The owner of Hobby Lobby. He said we were open 7 days a week, and he said we were making all kinds of money. And then the Lord began to deal with me about not working on the seventh day. And he said, I thought it was a great idea until the Lord said, I'm serious, And he said, I was terrified. And he said, right away, it looked like we were losing money. But he said it was only a matter of weeks before we began to realize we were making more money in 6 days than we had previously made in 7 days. Now, I don't know if they're still closed on Sunday. Do you know? Okay. So it's the principle of trust. You got to understand what the Sabbath was all about was not God saying, Justin, I'm going to fry you like sausage if I see you picking up a stick. It was God saying, Justin, I want you to know that when you put me first and you trust me, I will bless your 6 days so that they're more profitable than 7. It was a matter of trust. It was the principle that he had taught the generation earlier out in the wilderness. He says, I'll give you manna and you'll eat to your fill 7 days. But this is the way it works. On the seventh day, gather no manna. Now, on the 6th day, you can gather a double portion. But God did some amazingly miraculous things. If they gathered too much on one day, it would spoil. If they tried to hoard the food, it would spoil. But when they gathered on the 6th day, eating for the 6th and 7th day, it kept. It didn't spoil. So God was teaching them, I can do more in your life in 6 days than you can do in 7. We need to understand this. Let me go on. That's the principle of trust. That's what the Sabbath is about. And number 2, there's the principle of rest. It's so easy for us to get out of balance. Now, in our culture, most of us, taking a day off is not a problem for us. Our business or our employment is structured for us to have a day off. But you got to understand, in a culture like Israel's, in the ancient world, you live not only from hand to mouth, but from day to day. Most people in Israel, if you didn't go out and work that day, you didn't have money to get food to eat. In fact, to be considered wealthy in the culture of Israel, all you had to do to be considered wealthy is to not have to work every day. You were considered a person of wealth and of means if you were able to just say, I'm going to take a day off, But God, that's why it was a lesson about trust, but it was also a lesson about rest, because the tendency, when you live like that, you know how it is if you've ever been in that place. And probably most of us at one time or another in our lives, it's been day to day or week to week. So most of us understand what it's like, even if it's been a long time. But whenever your livelihood depends on making the next sale or getting that overtime, it's really easy to say, I need to work 7 days a week. I need to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And guys, we've all done it. We've all been in situations where we work 2 or 3 jobs. I've had to do that. You've had to do that. And sometimes that's just a season of life. But when you have to live that way for year after year after year, it's exhausting. And it not only exhausts you, but it creates a fear. If I don't work, I won't have. So we have a real tendency to get out of balance. I'm telling another story on myself, but I think I've always had a good work ethic. My dad and mom, who were a product of the Depression, really, you know how that generation was. They had a good, strong work ethic, and they instilled it in us. And I've never had a problem with the idea of working. I have had a problem sometimes with keeping balance. And I know when I came here 39 years old, you know. You say, I thought you'd been here longer than 4 years, but yeah, I was 39 years old, and I said, Lord, I need you to help me. Now, I've spent 20 years trying to figure out what I am and who I am and what you want me to do. Now, the rest of my life, I want you to help me to be productive. And for years, I had suffered with migraine headaches for years. And I averaged probably 3 a month. I mean, debilitating, go to bed, sleep 8 hours and maybe it'll go away. Debilitating headaches. The doctors gave me an experimental drug, that basically was a collection of illegal drugs in prescription strength. And it was a nasal spray. And he said, this may help with your headaches. And I used it. And I knew when I had those headaches, I was out for a day or two. And that was like almost every week. And in 7 minutes, that thing left. And Ramona said, you looked at me and said, I can't believe my headache is gone. And I said, I remember that. She said, but you don't remember what happened next. I said, no. And she said, you said, I can't believe my headache is gone. Your eyes kind of looked up, and then you went face down into the mud in the backyard. It's an interesting story, my relationship to that bottle of spray that I had. And she called the doctor. What's happening? He said, tell me what happened. And I told him, what I did. And he said, you sprayed 2 sprays? And I said, well, I have 2 nostrils. I thought I was supposed to, And he said, you just overdosed. And this was powerful stuff, I had a migraine, and I only used it like 4 times. And this is right after we moved here. I sat at the table, and all my precious little children were sitting there. And I said, guys, I've battled this for a day and a half. I'm going to have to go to the spray. And I sprayed, and Ramona said, hurry and eat, because you usually have 20 minutes or less. Hurry and eat and go upstairs. And my kids were terrified because I'm eating, talking to them about their day, and my face just goes down in the spaghetti. Next time I used it, they come upstairs, and I have socks doing a puppet show, singing the theme song to Frasier, And so I said, I can't take this anymore. This is, and in fact, you can't even get the drugs now. Several people died taking it. So, but I'm telling you, that's how desperate I was to get rid of these headaches. I had been here just a matter of just a few months, and I ended up in the emergency room. It was just so bad. They thought it was a brain tumor or whatever. And while I was in the hospital in the emergency room, I think it was David Field. He either was up at the hospital or took me to the hospital. I can't remember. My wife was there. And the Lord spoke to me. He said, this is nothing but you being out of balance, you being stressed, you not getting rest. He said, that's all this is. And I've had it for years now, just years. And I had given up on the headaches being gone. And this is what the Lord spoke to me. He said, if you will focus on being balanced, I will take these headaches away. And the only time you'll have another one of these headaches is when you let yourself get out of balance. The only time. And you say, well, boy, I didn't believe. I mean, this was a part of life to me. But God put faith in my heart, and I said, Lord, I believe you, and if you'll help me understand how to get balance. And God, while I was in that emergency room, God, it was after I got home, God took the headache away, and they stopped coming. And that was in 1995. And I can count on my fingers the number of headaches I've had since then. And every one of them, one I can't explain, but every one of them, except that one, it was related to stress. And the Lord spoke and said, you're out of balance. And that's a long story, but what I'm trying to tell you is that's how important balance is. Yeah. That's how important a Sabbath rest is. And, like I said, I can remember in the past, what would that be, 25 years or so? I can remember maybe 8 or 9 of those headaches. And with the exception of one, the Lord, I would be in such pain. I would say, Lord, what's going on? And the Lord would show me how I'd allowed myself to get out of balance with worry or stress or not sleeping. And I'm not proud of that. I've got some great drug stories, but I'm not proud of that. But I'm telling you, before that time, I didn't think the Sabbath was anything but an Old Testament principle. Wow. But I began to understand how important the Sabbath principle of rest is. It's a principle of worship. Now, the Jews of Jesus' day, Jesus had to explain to them that the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. But there was a principle of worship, and they had totally misunderstood what God was after in their lives. Then there was this question that we need to look at. Why do we gather on the first day of the week instead of the Sabbath? I would encourage you, it'll save us probably 15 minutes for me to just tell you to read this page. But what happens is in the New Testament, for instance, the 10 Commandments, every one of them is repeated in the New Testament except number 4, the principle of the Sabbath. Well, let me back up. The command to observe a day was not repeated in the New Testament, but the principle of the Sabbath is very clearly in the New Testament. You say, well, why do we worship on Sunday instead of Saturday? On that back of that last page, let me give you a 30 to 45 second answer. The church began to worship on Sunday because it was the Lord's day. It was Resurrection Day. Christ rose from the dead on Sunday. He met with his disciples 1 week after the resurrection on Sunday. He taught them on that day. He ascended to heaven on that day. He breathed new life into them on Sunday. The Spirit came on a Sunday. Paul is seen preaching in Troas on Sunday. Believers gathered on that day to receive communion and fellowship. Believers came together on that day to give their offerings. And on that day, Jesus appeared to John at Patmos. It was very clear that in the New Testament, there was a sanctifying of the first day of the week. And somebody put it this way: the Old Testament ended with rest. The New Testament begins with rest because of the completed work of Jesus Christ. Okay? And that second page will answer a lot of your questions. What are the Christian life lessons? Here's number 1. The Sabbath is based on the concept of dependency on the Lord. Now, we said that. Not only our time, not only do we give the Lord a day of the week, trusting Him to provide for us in 6 days instead of 7, but it's also with our money. The principle of the Sabbath is what's behind the tithe. It's the same thing. God says, I want you to know when you trust me just like I can do more with 6 days than you can with 7, you'll be able to do more with 90% instead of 100% when you honor the Lord. It's the same principle. The second Christian life lesson is that Sabbath observance for Christians is a principle of life, not an observance of a day. What you will find when you read this other page is that Paul made a very strong case more than once that Christians are not obligated to observe the Sabbath day as Jews were. Now, it's not that the Jews were wrong. It's not that the Jews failed. And I tell you what, you go to Israel today, the Sabbath day is phenomenal. I mean, it is phenomenal. You on Friday, you're in bumper-to-bumper standstill traffic in Tel Aviv. On Saturday, there's almost no traffic. One person put it to me this way: to get the hotel I was staying, to get from the hotel to the airport takes 45 minutes to an hour, except on the Sabbath. You can get there in 12 to 15 minutes because the only thing on the road are service vehicles and essential vehicles like ambulances and police and things like that. So we don't take issue with Israel for observing the Sabbath day, but Paul says Christ is our Sabbath. Everything that was a type of everything that these special days represent in the Old Testament are fulfilled in Christ. So he says in Colossians, he says in Galatians, he makes it clear, you do not have to observe these special days. Now, where this decision was made was in the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And this is the decision of John, the leader of the Jerusalem church, of James rather, the leader of the Jerusalem church. And it was the decision that was handed out to the new Gentile believers. The Old Testament was given to us to lead us to this day of Messiah. And here's our decision, he said. You do not have to become Jewish to become a Christian. You don't have to be, the men don't have to become circumcised. You don't have to keep the holy days or the feast days. He did say this, but you ought to honor and respect those who do honor those days. Don't let your liberty fly in their face. And that was the decision. You don't have to observe these days, but honor those who do and learn what these days have given us. So that's why, back in the 70s, I know all of you are too young to remember it, but back in the 70s when we had the energy crisis and the Yom Kippur War, and there was the OPEC embargo, and gas prices skyrocketed, and you couldn't even get gas where I lived. You had to wait in line for 2 hours or more to get 2 gallons of gas. You could only buy 2 gallons at a time. And there was talk of stopping all private commuting on Sundays as an effort to save energy and to save gas. And the churches panicked. They said, well, what are we going to do if we can't gather on Sunday? And I love what my pastor said. We'll meet on another day. But that's not the Lord's day. They actually said, that's not the Sabbath. He said, well, neither is Sunday. And my pastor explained, we have the freedom to meet whenever we choose to meet. We're not, our holiness is not attached to a day. Our obedience is attached to a principle. Okay, so the last lesson, Christians are allowed to honor the Sabbath day or another day that embraces the concept of dependency on the Lord. But the Sabbath is the first of the special days. Now, we're going to find out also that there was a Sabbath year. Every 7th year was a Sabbath year in which the land was to not be plowed. It was to not be planted. God was saying, you need a rest every 7 days. The land needs a rest every 7th year. And he said, I will so bless, oh, this is so beautiful. I will so bless your crops in the 6th year that you have enough to live on in the 7th. Wow. It's amazing, amazing. And then at the end of 7 Sabbath years, The 50th year was called the year of Jubilee, and that was the time when the whole economic clock of Israel was reset. It was very important to God for the families to have the land He had promised. And you were not allowed to sell your land except in cases of dire emergency. And this is the way it worked. Every 50th year, the land went back to its original owner. Now you say, well, that's not fair. Well, they thought differently than we do. Let's say Justin has a piece of land and it's worth $100, okay? If we're 50 years from the year of Jubilee, then I can buy his land and he has a right to demand full price. I pay the $100 knowing that in 50 years it's going to go back to him. You say, well, what if the year of Jubilee is only 25 years away? Then Justin knows, and I know, he can only demand $50 for the land because half of the time is already used up. If next year's the year of Jubilee and Justin needs to sell the land, he can only charge me $1. Okay, it was not a redistribution of wealth. It was not socialism or communism. God was saying sometimes things happen that you're in a bind and you need to sell your land. But understand this, I've given you this land as your inheritance. So with time, it's going to come back to you. And every time land was sold, every time land was rented, every time anything like that happened, it was always with the goal of a 50-year period. I might buy Justin's land, but it would only be mine for 50 years or 30 years, however many was left. So God said the Sabbath principle is this. Every seventh day you need to rest. Every seventh year you need to let the land rest. And at the end of 7 of these Sabbath years, we're going to have a celebration and everything's going to be restored to its original state. You say, well, what if somebody got rich in land speculation? Then they showed their trust in God by relinquishing the land that made them rich. And everybody went back to that starting place. You say, boy, I wonder if that'd work in America. No. But when God is over a nation and a nation commits to His principles, it's phenomenal. Justin, come lead us in prayer. And by the way, if you're here and you don't know this wonderful Lord that we serve, when He's through, Justin will tell you how you can know that you're saved. He'll tell you how you can receive prayer tonight. I'm going to ask you to forgive me. I need to slip out tonight. Sometimes we have so much going on Wednesdays, it doesn't all get done, and I need to slip out early, but Justin will take care of us.